The cantina was dark and filled with smoke. Old soldiers from different planets sat at small tables drinking and talking quietly. The air smelled of alien liquor and burned food. In the corner, Commander Vextar held his glass with 3 clawed fingers. His gray skin looked darker in the dim light. Around his table, younger soldiers leaned forward to listen. There was a Krillian with 4 arms, 2 Bendari twins with silver eyes, and a young Zephyrian pilot who looked nervous. They had all heard stories about the war with humans, but none had fought against them directly. Vextar took a long drink and set his glass down slowly. His orange eyes glowed in the darkness as he looked at each young face around the table. "You want to know about humans," he said in his deep voice. "You think you understand war because you have fought other aliens. You think war has rules. You think enemies act like you expect them to act." The young Krillian soldier shifted in his chair. "Commander, we have studied human military records. They use standard tactics. They follow the same basic rules of warfare that all civilized species follow." Vextar made a sound that might have been laughter, but it had no humor in it. "Standard tactics, civilized rules." He shook his head slowly. "Let me tell you about Kepler Station, boy. Let me tell you about the ghosts." The table became quiet. Even the noise from other tables seemed to fade away. "It was 3 years ago," Vextar began. "Kepler Station was a human military outpost in the Outer Rim. Not very big, maybe 5,000 humans living there. It was built inside a large asteroid, very well protected. Thick armor, good shields, powerful weapons. The kind of place that could hold off a fleet for months." He paused to drink again. "Our command decided to take it. Simple plan. Surround the station, cut off their supplies, wait for them to surrender. Standard siege tactics. We had 40 ships, they had maybe 10. The math was easy." The young Zephyrian pilot leaned forward. "What went wrong?" "Everything," Vextar said. "We started the siege on a Tuesday. By Thursday, we were getting strange reports from our advanced scouts. The human ships around the station were not fighting back properly. They would fire a few shots, then retreat into the asteroid field. Very odd behavior." He set his glass down and stared at it. "On Friday, we sent boarding parties to capture some of the smaller human ships. Easy targets, or so we thought. The first team found a ship with no crew aboard. Empty. But the ship's systems were still running, and there were signs that people had been there recently." "Where did they go?" asked one of the Bendari twins. "That was the question. We searched 3. More ships, all empty. No bodies, no signs of fighting. Just empty ships with warm engines and fresh food still on the tables. Like the crews had just vanished into space." Vextar's voice became quieter. "Our sensors could not find any escape pods. No other ships had. Picked them up. They were just gone. Command decided that the humans were playing games with us, trying to make us nervous, so we moved closer to the station itself." The cantina seemed even darker now. Other conversations had stopped, and soldiers at nearby tables were listening to Vextar's story. "We demanded that the station surrender." A human officer came on the communication screen. Young man, maybe 30 human years old. Brown hair, calm, blue eyes. He said his name was Lieutenant Jake Morrison. He was very polite when he refused to surrender. "What did he say?" the Krillian asked. "He said, 'Commander, my orders are to defend this station. I will carry out those orders.' Very simple, very direct." Then he smiled, and that smile made my skin crawl. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who knows a secret that you do not know. Vextar picked up his glass but did not drink. He just held it and stared into the liquid. We began the boarding operation 3 days later. Standard procedure. Cut through the outer hull, send in teams through multiple entry points, secure the important areas. We had done this 100 times on other stations. He finally took a drink. The first teams reported normal progress. They were inside the station, moving through empty corridors. No resistance, no human defenders, just empty hallways and dark rooms. Too easy, but we pushed forward. Then the first team went silent. Complete communication blackout. We tried to contact them, but nothing. The second team reported that they had found the first team's equipment scattered in a corridor, but no bodies, no blood, no signs of a fight. The young soldiers around the table looked at each other nervously. The second team went silent. 20 minutes later. Then the third team. Then the fourth. Every team we sent in would report normal progress for a while, then just disappear. Like the station was eating them. Vextar set his glass down hard enough to make a sharp sound. Command was getting angry. We sent in a full company of Krillian shock troops. These were our best warriors, trained for exactly this kind of fighting. They had the best armor, the best weapons, the best training. They lasted longer than the other teams. 2 hours. We could hear them talking to each other, reporting their positions, doing everything right. Then we heard screaming. The Krillian soldier shifted uncomfortably. What kind of screaming? The kind that makes you glad you are not there. The kind that makes you want to run away even when you are safe on your own ship. It went on for 10 minutes, then stopped. When we tried to contact them, we got silence. Vextar's orange eyes seemed to glow brighter in the dim light. But that was not the worst part. The worst part came an hour later. The station's communication system activated, and we heard the screaming again. But this time, it was being broadcast on all frequencies. The screams of our own soldiers, played back to us over and over. Then Morrison's voice came through the speakers, still calm, still polite. He said, "Commander, I want you to understand something. This station has been my home for 2 years. I know every corridor, every room, every pipe and wire. My friends, and I, we have had time to prepare for your visit." The young Zephyrian pilot swallowed hard. How many humans were left on the station? That was the question we should have asked earlier. We had estimated maybe a few hundred military personnel. We were wrong. Morrison told us the truth during that broadcast. He had 12 people with him, 12 humans against 40 ships and thousands of soldiers. Vextar laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. 12 people, engineers mostly, with some mechanics and technicians. Not soldiers, not warriors, just people who knew how to fix things and make things work. But they were doing things that no one had ever seen before in warfare. They had turned the entire station into a weapon. They were using the life support system to create poison gas in certain areas. They had reprogrammed the maintenance robots to carry explosives. They were controlling the gravity generators to crush our soldiers in specific corridors. The table was completely silent now. Even the other soldiers in the cantina had stopped talking to listen. Every time we sent in a new team, Morrison would find a new way to kill them. Sometimes it was explosive decompression. Sometimes it was electrocution through modified environmental suits. Sometimes the teams would just get lost in corridors that seemed to change shape. Vextar picked up his glass and finished his drink in one gulp. But the worst part was not how they killed our soldiers. The worst part was how they used the bodies afterward. Morrison and his people would arrange the bodies in patterns. Messages written in our own languages using the corpses of our own troops. They learned to write in Krillian, in Zephyrian, in Bendari. They would spell out threats and promises. You will all die here. Your families will never see you again. We are coming for your ships next. The young soldiers around the table looked sick. The Krillian had all 4 arms wrapped around his chest, and the Bendari twins were holding hands. The siege lasted 4 months. 4 months of sending in teams and losing them. 4 months of hearing our own soldiers screaming from the station's speakers. 4 months of Morrison's calm voice explaining new ways that he was going to kill us. Vextar signaled for another drink. In the end, Command made a decision that goes against every rule of civilized warfare. They ordered a full orbital bombardment of the station while our own troops were still inside. They killed thousands of our own soldiers just to stop Morrison and his 12 humans. The server brought him a new glass, and he took a large drink before continuing. The bombardment lasted for 6 hours. We poured enough firepower into that asteroid to crack a moon. When it was over, there was nothing left but debris and radiation. He paused and looked around the table at the young faces. But even then, Morrison had the last word. For 3 weeks after the bombardment, we kept receiving transmissions from the wreckage. Emergency beacons that had been programmed to broadcast messages in our languages. What did they say? The young Zephyrian whispered. Vextar smiled, but it was not a pleasant smile. They said, "Thank you for the target practice. Next time, bring more soldiers. These ones broke too easily." The table was silent for a long moment. Finally, the Krillian soldier spoke up. "But Commander, 12 humans against our entire fleet. How is that possible?" Vexitar looked at him with those glowing orange eyes. "That is what you do not understand about humans, boy. They do not fight the way other species fight. They do not think about winning or losing the way we do. They think about making their enemies pay the highest price possible." The young soldiers sat in stunned silence after Vexitar's first story. The cantina felt colder now, and the dim lights seemed to flicker more than before. Other patrons had moved closer to listen, creating a circle of alien faces in the darkness. All eyes were on the old Zephyrian commander as he returned to his seat. Vextar ordered another drink and waited for it to arrive. The silence stretched on until the young Krillian soldier finally spoke up. "Commander, that was just one station. Surely not all human soldiers fight like that." Vextar looked at him with those glowing orange eyes. "You think Morrison was special? You think he was unusual among humans?" He shook his head slowly. "Let me tell you about Nexus 7. Let me tell you about the Devil of Titan Ridge." The server brought his drink, and Vextar took a long sip before continuing. Nexus 7 was a jungle world in the Kappa sector. Thick forests, heavy rain, lots of places to hide. The kind of planet where ground warfare becomes very difficult. He set his glass down carefully. "Our intelligence said there was a human platoon, trapped in a valley called Titan Ridge. Maybe 30 soldiers cut off from their main force, surrounded by our troops with no way out." One of the Bendari twins leaned forward. "Sounds like an easy operation." "That is what we thought," Vextar said. "Command assigned 3 companies to clean up this small problem. 900 of our best soldiers against 30 humans. The math seemed simple." Vextar paused to drink again. "The platoon was led by a human female, Sergeant Lisa Hayes. Our file said she was a combat engineer, specialized in building things and blowing things up. 28 years old, 5 years of military service, nothing special on paper. We dropped our troops into the valley on a Monday morning. The plan was simple. Surround the humans, demand surrender, finish the operation by dinner time. A routine cleanup mission." The old commander's voice became quieter. "By Tuesday night, we had lost contact with our first company. 150 soldiers just gone. No distress calls, no battle reports, nothing. They had simply vanished into the jungle. The second company found some of their equipment scattered around a small clearing. Weapons, armor pieces, communication gear. But no bodies, no blood, no signs of what had happened to the soldiers." The young Zephyrian pilot swallowed nervously. "Where did they go?" "We found out later," Vextar said. "But not in a way we expected. On Wednesday morning, our remaining troops started finding things, hanging from the trees, pieces of armor arranged in patterns, communication devices programmed to play recordings." "What kind of recordings?" asked the Krillian. Vextar's claws clicked against his glass. "The voices of our missing soldiers, calling for help, screaming, in pain, begging for their mothers." But these recordings had been edited and mixed with other sounds. Human music, animal noises from the jungle, the sound of rain falling. It was psychological warfare like we had never seen before. Hayes and her people were not just killing our soldiers. They were using their voices to create fear among the troops still alive. He took another drink. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the messages they left with the recordings, written in perfect Krillian, Zephyrian, and Bendari languages. Hayes had somehow learned to write in all our languages. "What did the messages say?" one of the Bendari twins asked. "They said things like, 'We know where you sleep, and we can smell your fear, and you will never leave this jungle alive.' Simple messages, but very effective." Our troops were getting scared. Vextar looked around the table at the young faces. By Thursday, our soldiers were refusing to go on patrol alone. They would only move in large groups, and even then they were jumping at every sound in the jungle. Command decided to send in more troops. Another full company, this time with heavy weapons and air support. They were going to burn down the entire valley if necessary. The cantina had become completely quiet now. Even the servers had stopped moving around to listen to the story. The new company lasted 2 days, Vextar continued. 2 days before they started sending panic reports about ghosts in the jungle. Soldiers who appeared and disappeared like smoke. Humans who seemed to be everywhere at once. Our troops would set up camp in a clearing, post guards, follow all proper procedures. In the morning, they would wake up to find one of their sentries missing, just gone with his weapon and equipment left behind. Vextar's voice became even quieter. But Hayes left calling cards. She would arrange the missing soldier's gear to spell out messages, usually just one word. Mine, or next, or soon. The psychological pressure was incredible. Our soldiers were not sleeping. They were afraid to eat field rations because they thought the humans might have poisoned them. They were afraid to use their communication equipment because they thought Hayes was listening. One of the young soldiers shifted uncomfortably in his chair. How could 30 humans do this to hundreds of trained soldiers? That is the question we should have asked from the beginning, Vexitar said. Hayes had done something that no military academy teaches. She had convinced her soldiers to stop being soldiers and start being hunters. Humans are persistence predators. On their homeworld, they used to hunt animals by chasing them until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. Hayes applied this same principle to warfare. Vextar picked up his glass and stared into it. Her soldiers had modified their equipment in ways that violated every military regulation. They had removed the identifying marks from their uniforms. They had painted their faces with mud and plant dyes. They had learned to move through the jungle without making any sound. Most importantly, they had learned to think like the animals they were hunting. They studied our behavior patterns, our communication procedures, our daily routines. They learned when we were most vulnerable and when we were most alert. By the end of the first week, Hayes and her people were not fighting like human soldiers anymore. They were fighting like jungle predators who happened to have military training. The young Krillian soldier leaned back in his chair. How long did this go on? 3 months, Vextar said. 3 months of pure nightmare. Our troops would find bodies arranged in circles, with each soldier positioned to spell out threats in our own languages. They would discover equipment caches that had been booby-trapped with explosives made from modified medical supplies. Hayes had turned her entire platoon into a pack of human wolves. They hunted in small groups, they communicated without using radios, and they seemed to know exactly where our troops would be before we got there. Vextar took a large drink and set his glass down hard. The worst incident happened in the 7th week. A full squad of our troops was found arranged in a perfect circle in a jungle clearing. Each soldier was positioned to spell out, "You are next," in Zephyrian script. But they were not dead. They were paralyzed. Hayes had somehow weaponized medical nanites to cause temporary paralysis. Our soldiers were completely awake and aware, but they could not move or speak. They had been left there for 3 days before a patrol found them. 3 days of lying in the jungle, unable to move, watching insects crawl over their bodies and listening to the sounds of the hunt going on around them. The table was completely silent. The young soldiers looked sick. When our medical teams examined the paralyzed soldiers, they found small cuts on their arms and legs, precise surgical cuts that had been treated with medical gel to prevent infection. Hayes had been taking samples. Samples of what? The Zephyrian pilot whispered. Blood, tissue, genetic material. She was studying us like laboratory specimens, learning our biology so she could find better ways to hurt us. Vextar signaled for another drink. By the 10th week, our remaining troops were in a state of complete psychological collapse. They were reporting ghost sightings, phantom attacks, and impossible encounters with humans who seemed to appear and disappear at will. Command finally decided to end the operation with orbital bombardment. They were going to burn down the entire jungle rather than lose any more troops to Hayes and her pack. But Hayes had anticipated this. On the night before the bombardment, every surviving member of our ground force received a personal message on their private communication devices. How did she get their private frequencies? asked one of the Bendari twins. We never found out. But each message was different, customized for the individual soldier. Hayes had somehow learned personal details about each of our troops. Their names, their home planets, the names of their families. Vextar's voice became almost a whisper. The messages were very simple. Each one said something like, "Hello, Marcus. I know where your family lives on Zephyr Prime. I know your daughter goes to school on 3rd Street. I know your wife works at the medical center. When this war is over, I will visit them." Every single soldier got a message like that. Personal threats against their families, with enough specific details to prove that Hayes actually knew where their loved ones lived. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background noise from the kitchen had stopped. The orbital bombardment began at dawn. For 6 hours, our ships poured fire into that valley. When it was over, there was nothing left but burned ground and ash. Vextar picked up his new drink and took a small sip. 3 days later, emergency beacons started transmitting from the ruins. The same personal messages, broadcast on repeat. The cantina had grown even darker as more patrons gathered around to listen to Vextar's stories. The old commander sat back down heavily, his orange eyes reflecting the dim light as he looked at the young soldiers around his table. Their faces showed a mixture of fear and fascination that he had seen many times before. A server brought him another drink without being asked. Word was spreading through the station that the famous Vextar was telling war stories, and more beings were crowding into the cantina to listen. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of different alien alcohols. 2 stories, Vextar said quietly. 2 examples of how humans think about warfare. But you still do not understand the worst part about fighting them. The young Zephyrian pilot leaned forward. What do you mean, Commander? I mean that humans do not fight alone, Vextar said. They have this thing they call pack bonding. They will die for each other, yes, but they will also convince complete strangers to die for them. He took a sip of his drink and stared into the liquid. Let me tell you about the Crying Stars incident. Let me tell you about Commander Rick Davis and what happened in the Vega asteroid belt. The crowd pressed closer. Even aliens from species that had never fought humans wanted to hear this story. It was 18 months ago, Vextar began. The war was going badly for the humans. We had captured most of their outer colonies and were pushing toward their core systems. The Vega system was important because it had mining operations that supplied raw materials to human shipyards. Our fleet moved into the system with 16 dreadnoughts and 30 escort ships, a massive force designed to crush any resistance. Quickly, intelligence reports said there was only one human warship in the system, a light cruiser called the Defiant. One of the Bendari twins spoke up. One ship against your entire fleet? That is what we thought, Vextar said. Commander, Davis was in charge of the Defiant. Our intelligence file said he was 42 years old, 20 years of military service, good record but nothing special. Just another human officer about to die for a lost cause. Vextar's claws clicked against his glass. We entered the asteroid belt expecting a quick surrender or a glorious but pointless last stand. What we got was 3 weeks of absolute nightmare. The first attack came 6 hours after we entered the system. Our lead dreadnought suddenly took fire from 3 different directions. Impossible, because our sensors showed only one human ship in the area. But Davis was not fighting like a normal ship captain. He was using the asteroids as cover, firing from one position and then disappearing behind the rocks before we could return fire, like a child playing hide and seek except with weapons that could crack our hulls. The young Krillian soldier frowned. One ship should not be able to hide from your sensors. That is what we thought too, Vextar said. But Davis knew something we did not know. The asteroid belt was full of civilian mining operations, hundreds of small ships, mining platforms, and supply stations, all of them run by human civilians. Vextar took another drink. On the second day, we started getting attacked by mining ships. Cargo haulers loaded with explosives would ram our vessels. Industrial mining lasers would fire at our engines. Or processing stations would launch chunks of metal at our hulls using magnetic accelerators. These were not military attacks. These were desperate acts by people who had no military training and no proper weapons, but they were coordinated. Someone was telling them exactly when, and where to attack. The cantina was completely silent. Now every alien present was listening to the story. Davis was using civilian communication channels to coordinate these attacks. He would broadcast targeting information to mining crews and tell them exactly when to fire their industrial equipment at our ships. But the worst part was not the attacks themselves. The worst part was what Davis broadcast on our military frequencies while the attacks were happening. Vextar's voice became quieter. He would play recordings of our own soldiers calling for help as they died, mixed with children's lullabies from our homeworlds, Krillian death songs mixed with Bendari nursery rhymes, Zephyrian funeral prayers, mixed with the screams of our wounded. How did he get recordings of our soldiers? Asked the Zephyrian pilot. We never found out. But Davis seemed to know everything about us. He knew the names of our ship captains, the home planets of our crew members, even personal details about their families. Vextar set his glass down hard. On the fourth day, Captain Morteus of the Dreadnought Thunder received a personal message on his private channel. Davis spoke directly to him using his first name. He said, "Hello, Vex, I know your daughter just started school on Krill Prime. I know she likes to play in the park near your house. I hope she's having a good day." Davis was not threatening Captain Morteus directly. He was just letting him know that he had access to personal information about his family. The psychological impact was devastating. The young soldiers around the table looked disturbed. The idea of an enemy knowing personal details about their loved ones was terrifying. Every ship captain in our fleet started receiving similar messages, personal information about their families, their homes, their private lives. Davis had somehow gained access to our personnel files and was using that information as a weapon. Vextar signaled for another drink. By the end of the first week, 3 of our ship captains had suffered complete nervous breakdowns. They were removed from command and sent to medical facilities. But Davis was not finished. He started broadcasting what he called memorial services for our dead soldiers. He would read their names, their ages, their home planets. He would talk about their families and what they would never get to do because they had died in his asteroid belt. These were not mocking or cruel broadcasts. Davis spoke with genuine sadness about each soldier who died. He made it sound like he personally regretted their deaths while still promising to kill more of us. The server brought Vextar his drink, and he took a long sip before continuing. The mining operations in the asteroid belt had become a network of civilian warriors. Grandparents who ran small mining claims were using explosives to attack our ships. Children were helping to coordinate attacks using civilian communication equipment. Davis had convinced an entire population of non-combatants to join his war. People who had never held weapons were suddenly building bombs and planning suicide attacks against military vessels. One of the Bendari twins shook her head. How did he convince civilians to fight a military force? That is the terrifying thing about human pack bonding, Vextar said. Davis did not have to convince them, he just had to ask them. Humans will fight and die for each other even when they barely know each other. A mining family with 3 small children volunteered to ram their cargo ship into one of our dreadnoughts. An elderly couple who had been mining asteroids for 30 years used their life savings to buy explosives and attack our supply convoy. Vextar's voice became almost a whisper. These people were not soldiers. They were not even particularly brave by human standards. They were just ordinary people who decided that their lives were less important than stopping our fleet. By the second week, we were facing coordinated attacks from hundreds of civilian vessels. Davis had turned the entire asteroid belt into a weapon system controlled by people who had everything to lose and nothing to gain. Our fleet commanders were going insane trying to fight an enemy that included babies and grandparents. Every time we destroyed a mining ship, Davis would broadcast the names and ages of everyone who died, including the children. The cantina had become so quiet that the only sound was Vextar's voice and the occasional clink of glasses. The psychological warfare was unlike anything we had ever experienced. Davis would play recordings of human children singing songs about peace and friendship, mixed with the sound of our weapons destroying their homes. He would broadcast messages from dying miners to their families, telling them not to be sad because they were dying for something important. Messages from children who were about to be killed by our weapons saying they hoped we would learn to be better people someday. Vextar finished his drink in one gulp. By the third week, half of our fleet was requesting permission to withdraw from the system. Our soldiers were refusing to fire on civilian targets, even when those targets were attacking us. 3 ship captains committed suicide rather than continue the battle. Our medical facilities were full of soldiers suffering from what the doctors called moral injury syndrome. They could not handle killing people who were not really warriors. Davis was destroying our fleet without using proper military tactics. He was using our own sense of honor against us. Every time we killed civilians, we became less effective as a fighting force. The young Krillian soldier looked confused. But you still had superior firepower. You could have destroyed the entire asteroid belt. Yes, Vextar said. We could have. And Davis knew we could have. That is why his final broadcast was the most terrifying thing any of us had ever heard. Vextar stood up and looked around at all the faces watching him. On the last day of the battle, Davis sent a message to every ship in our fleet. He provided exact coordinates for the home systems of every officer present. Not just the ship captains, but every officer down to junior lieutenants. The cantina was packed now. Word had spread throughout the station that Commander Vextar was telling the real stories of the human war. Aliens from dozens of species crowded around tables and stood against walls, all waiting to hear more. The Kyo. Air was thick with smoke and tension. Vextar returned to his seat one more time. His orange eyes looked tired, but there was something else in them now. Something that might have been respect or fear or both. He ordered another drink and waited for the crowd to settle down. 3 stories, he said finally. 3 examples of how humans think about war. But you still have not heard the worst. 1. You have not heard about what happens when humans decide they have nothing left to lose. The young Zephyrian pilot shifted nervously in his chair. Commander, how could it get worse than what you have already told us? Vextar looked at him for a long moment. Because the stories I have told you were about humans who were still trying to survive. Let me tell you about humans who had given up on survival, but refused to give up on fighting. He took a sip of his drink. Colony World Baker 7, a small, human settlement in the Rim territories. Maybe 50,000 people, mostly farmers and miners. Not a military target by any normal definition. But Baker 7 was in the path of our final advance toward human core systems. Command decided it needed to be taken to secure our supply lines. A simple operation. Land troops, accept surrender, move on to the next target. One of the Bendari twins leaned forward. What went wrong? Everything, Vextar said. The colony was defended by 200 human Marines led by Captain Amy Foster. Our intelligence said she was a logistics officer, specialized in supply management and equipment maintenance, not a combat leader. We landed 3,000 troops on Baker 7, 15-1 odds in our favor. The human Marines should have surrendered immediately or died within a few days. Instead, the siege lasted 8 months. Vextar's claws clicked against his glass. Foster did something that no military academy teaches. She implemented what she called the Marathon Protocol. She turned her Marines into something that was not quite human anymore. What do you mean? Asked the young Krillian soldier. I mean, she convinced her people to survive on almost nothing while fighting constantly. 2 hours of sleep per day, 1 small meal every other day. No medical treatment except for wounds that would cause immediate death. Vexitar shook his head slowly. Any other species would have collapsed within a week. But Foster's Marines kept fighting for 8 months, under conditions that should have killed them. The worst part was not that they survived under these conditions. The worst part was that they became more dangerous as they became more desperate. The cantina was completely silent. Even the background noise from the kitchen had stopped. Our soldiers would encounter human Marines who had been awake for 3 days straight, who had not eaten in 2 days, who were fighting with weapons held together with wire and tape, and these humans would still win the battle. Foster had done something to her people's minds. She had convinced them that pain and exhaustion were just feelings that could be ignored, that hunger and thirst were distractions that could be set aside. Vextar took another drink. By the 3rd month, our medical officers were studying captured human Marines like they were a new species. These humans could function with injuries that would hospitalize soldiers from any other race. A human Marine would continue fighting with a broken arm. Another would run for hours with a leg wound that should have made walking impossible. They seemed to have developed an immunity to pain and exhaustion. But the most disturbing thing was their emotional state. Foster's Marines were happy. They laughed while they were being shot at. They sang songs while they treated their own wounds. They acted like the siege was some kind of game that they were enjoying. One of the young soldiers at the table looked sick. "That is not normal behavior." "No," Vextar agreed. "It is not normal for any species we know." But Foster had taught her people to find joy in the act of fighting itself, regardless of whether they won or lost. Our psychological warfare specialists tried to break their morale by broadcasting news of human defeats in other systems. Foster's Marines would cheer when they heard about human colonies being destroyed, because it meant more enemies for them to fight later. Vextar's voice became quieter. They had stopped caring about winning the war. They only cared about making each day of fighting as difficult as possible for us. By the 4th month, our own troops were developing psychological problems. They were afraid to fight an enemy that seemed to enjoy being hurt. Our soldiers started requesting transfers away from Baker 7. Foster's Marines would leave messages for our troops, not threats or insults, but invitations. They would write things like, "Thank you for the target practice today. Please bring more. Friends tomorrow." The server brought Vextar another drink, moving carefully through the crowded cantina. Aliens pressed closer to hear every word of the story. The siege became a test of endurance between our fresh troops and Foster's dying Marines. And somehow the dying Marines were winning. Our soldiers were getting proper food, proper sleep, proper medical care. Foster's people were surviving on scraps and willpower. But every day our casualties were higher than theirs. Foster had turned her Marines into persistence predators, just like humans used to be on their home world. They were hunting us by wearing us down day after day until we made mistakes from exhaustion and frustration. Vextar stared into his drink. By the 6th month, 3 of our battalion commanders had requested psychiatric evaluation. They could not understand how they were losing to an enemy that should have been dead months ago. Our troops started, reporting that the human Marines were not fighting like normal soldiers anymore. They moved differently, reacted differently, even looked different. "What do you mean, looked different?" the Zephyrian pilot asked. Our soldiers said the humans looked like hungry animals, thin from lack of food, scarred from months of fighting, but with eyes that were still bright and eager for more combat. Foster herself became a legend among our troops. They called her the Ghost Captain because she seemed to be everywhere at once. Our soldiers would report seeing her in 3 different locations at the same time. Vextar took a large drink. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. Foster had stopped sleeping entirely. She was running on stimulants and pure determination, moving constantly around the battlefield to coordinate her Marines' actions. By the 7th month, our medical officers estimated that Foster had not slept for more than 2 hours in any single day for over 6 months. She should have been dead from exhaustion, but she was still giving orders and leading attacks. Our final assault came in the 8th month. We brought in fresh troops, heavy weapons, air support. Everything needed to crush the remaining human Marines once and for all. The cantina crowd pressed even closer. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. We expected to find maybe 50 humans still alive, probably too weak to fight effectively. Instead, we found 140 Marines who were stronger and more dangerous than when the siege had started. Foster had done the impossible. She had kept her people not just alive, but combat effective for 8 months under conditions that should have killed them in weeks. The final battle lasted 3 days. Our fresh troops with full equipment against Foster's dying Marines with improvised weapons. And for 3 days the outcome was in doubt. Vexatar's voice became almost a whisper. On the final day, Foster herself led a charge against our command post. She had been shot 4 times and was bleeding from wounds all over her body, but she was still fighting. Our soldiers described her as moving like a force of nature. She seemed to feel no pain, show no fear, display no doubt about what she was doing. She reached our command bunker and threw a grenade made from medical supplies and mining explosives. The blast killed 12 of our officers and wounded 20 more. Foster died in that explosion, along with the last of her Marines. But even in death, she had accomplished something unprecedented. Vextar finished his drink and set the glass down carefully. When our reinforcements arrived to secure the planet, they found that Foster's Marines had actually expanded their defensive perimeter during the siege. 8 months of constant fighting against superior numbers, and the humans had gained ground. They had started the siege controlling a small area around the main settlement. They ended it controlling half the continent. The young soldiers around the table stared at him in disbelief. Foster had trained her people to see exhaustion and pain as advantages rather than weaknesses. She convinced them that the worse they felt, the more dangerous they became. Our post-battle analysis showed that Foster's Marines had actually improved their combat effectiveness over the course of the siege. They became better fighters as they became more desperate. Vextar stood up slowly. The marathon protocol broke, something fundamental in our military doctrine. We had assumed that all soldiers become less effective as they become more tired and hungry and hurt. Foster proved that humans become more effective under those conditions. She showed us that desperation is not a weakness for humans, it is a weapon. He looked around at all the faces watching him. The cantina had become completely packed. Aliens stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed against walls and crowded around tables. Some had climbed onto chairs to see over the crowd. Word had spread throughout the entire station that Commander Vextar was telling the true stories of the human war. But now something had changed. The old Zephyrian commander looked different as he made his way back to his table one final time. His orange eyes held a weight that had not been there before. His movements were slower, more careful, like someone carrying something heavy and fragile. The crowd sensed the change, too. The usual noise of the cantina had died away completely. Even the servers had stopped moving, standing frozen with drinks in their hands as they waited to hear the final story. Vexitar sat down heavily and stared at his empty glass for a long moment. When the server approached with another drink, he waved her away with one clawed hand. 4 stories, he said quietly. 4 examples of how humans think about war. But none of those stories explain why the war ended the way it did. The young Zephyrian pilot leaned forward. Commander, what do you mean? We won the war, did we not? Vextar looked at him with those glowing orange eyes. Did we? Did we really win? He shook his head slowly. Let me tell you about the final battle at Centauri Gates. Let me tell you about Colonel Ben Parker and the last transmission. The crowd pressed even closer. This was the story they had all come to hear. The final battle that had ended the war between humans and the Coalition. Centauri Gates was the last line of defense before Earth itself, Vexitar began. If we could break through there, we would have a clear path to the human homeworld. The war would be over. Our fleet was massive. 200 ships of all classes, carrying 500,000 soldiers, the largest military force ever assembled by the Coalition. Nothing could stand against us. The human defense fleet had maybe 30 ships, old vessels, some of them converted civilian craft. They were commanded by Colonel Ben Parker, a human who had been fighting us for 3 years. Vextar's voice became quieter. Our intelligence files said Parker was 51 years old, a career military officer with a reputation for following orders exactly as given. Nothing special about him except his long service record. The battle should have lasted hours at most. Our ships outnumbered the humans 7-1. Our firepower advantage was even greater. By every calculation, it would be a complete victory. One of the Bendari twins spoke up. What went wrong this time? Nothing went wrong, Vextar said. That is what made it so terrifying. Everything went exactly as Parker planned. He signaled for water instead of alcohol. The battle began at dawn, ship time. Our fleet moved into attack formation and demanded the humans surrender. Standard procedure. Parker came on the communication screen to respond. I was on the bridge of the flagship, so I saw him directly. He looked tired, like someone who had not slept in days. But his voice was completely calm. He said, Coalition Fleet, this is Colonel Ben Parker of the Earth Defense Force. I have orders to defend this system. I will carry out those orders. Vextar paused to drink his water. Our fleet commander laughed when he heard that. He told Parker that resistance was hopeless, that surrender would save human lives, that continued fighting would only delay the inevitable. Parker listened to the entire speech without interrupting. When our commander finished, Parker said, "Thank you for the offer. My answer is no." Just like that. No emotion, no anger, no dramatic speeches, just a simple refusal to surrender. The cantina was so quiet that every word Vextar spoke seemed to echo in the darkness. The battle began with our standard opening bombardment, overwhelming firepower designed to break enemy morale quickly. But something was wrong with the human response. Parker's ships were fighting back, yes, but not like they were trying to win. They were fighting like they were trying to buy time. Every human ship that was destroyed took as long as possible to die. Our tactical officers noticed it first. Human ships that should have exploded quickly were somehow staying in the fight for extra minutes. Ships that should have retreated were holding position until they were completely destroyed. Vextar's claws clicked against his water glass. By the third hour of battle, we had destroyed most of the human fleet. Only Parker's flagship and 4 other ships were still fighting. The outcome was certain. But our victory was taking much longer than it should have. Parker's people were making us work for every kill. They were extracting the maximum possible cost for every human ship we destroyed. Then Parker did something that none of our tactical computers had predicted. He opened a communication channel to our entire fleet and began talking. "What did he say?" asked the young Krillian soldier. Vextar was quiet for a long moment. He started by explaining the tactical situation to his own people. Very calmly, very professionally. He told them exactly how many coalition ships they were facing and what their chances of survival were. 0%. He told his own people that they had 0% chance of survival, that they were all going to die in the next few hours. But then he said something that I will never forget. He said, "That is not important. What is important is that we make them remember this day forever." The crowd in the cantina was completely silent. Even the aliens who had never fought humans were listening with growing horror. Parker began broadcasting what he called his last stand protocol. He explained to his people exactly how they were going to die, and exactly how they could make their deaths count for the most. He was not trying to boost morale or give them false hope. He was teaching them how to die in the most effective way possible. Vextar's voice became almost a whisper. Each human ship captain acknowledged the orders with complete calm. No fear, no despair, no last requests. Just professional acceptance of their mission. Then Parker did something that broke our psychological warfare specialists. He began broadcasting recordings of children singing on Earth. Not military songs or battle hymns, just children singing simple songs about friendship and peace and hope for the future. Songs that human children had been singing for hundreds of years. While his ships were being destroyed around him, while his people were dying, Parker filled our communication channels with the voices of human children singing lullabies. Vextar took another sip of water. Our fleet commander ordered him to stop the broadcast. Parker refused. Our jamming systems could not block it because Parker was transmitting on every frequency simultaneously. So while we were killing the last human defenders between us and Earth, we had to listen to human children singing about how wonderful the universe could be if everyone learned to be kind to each other. The psychological impact on our troops was devastating. Our soldiers were destroying the last hope of an entire species while listening to their children sing songs about peace. The young Zephyrian pilot looked confused. Why would Parker do that? What was the tactical advantage? There was no tactical advantage, Vextar said. That is what made it so effective. Parker was not trying to win the battle. He was trying to win something more important. By the 6th hour, only Parker's flagship was still fighting. His ship was crippled, his weapons were failing, his crew was dying around him. Our fleet commander demanded his surrender one final time. Parker came on the screen again. He looked even more tired than before, and there was blood on his uniform. But his voice was still completely calm. He said, "Coalition fleet, I want you to understand something. You are about to destroy the last ship standing between you and Earth. When you do that, you will have won this war. Then he paused and smiled. It was not a happy smile, but it was not bitter either. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret. Vextar's orange eyes glowed brighter in the dim light. Parker said, "But I want you to remember something forever. This is what you had to do to win. You had to bring 200 ships and 500,000 soldiers to defeat 30 ships and 15,000 humans. And even then, we made you work for it." The cantina was so quiet that the only sound was Vextar's voice and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Parker's final transmission was not a military report. It was a recording he had made for his family back on Earth. A message to his wife and 2 children, telling them that he loved them and that he was proud to die defending their home. He played that personal message on all frequencies, so our entire fleet could hear it. A simple private moment between a father and his family, broadcast to 500,000 enemy soldiers. Then Parker said something that ended the war, even though we won the battle. He said, "This is what you are trying to destroy. Remember that." Vextar finished his water and set the glass down carefully. Parker detonated his ship's reactor core while it was in the middle of our formation. The explosion destroyed his flagship and 3 of our escort vessels. But that was not the end of Parker's plan. The reactor explosion created a temporary rift in spacetime. The energy release was so massive that it scattered our fleet across the system. By the time we regrouped, something had changed. Our fleet commanders were receiving reports from ship captains requesting permission to withdraw from the system. "Why would they want to withdraw after winning the battle?" asked one of the Bendari twins.